Grandma would have her gallon jar filled with fresh milk heavy with cream, which she'd churn until it was butter. The lightning bugs would flash on and off as the light faded and the moon came up. The butter would taste great on our biscuits the next morning, or in the following night's blackberry cobbler, the best I ever had. You can be sure she picked the berries herself. Grandma was also the person who introduced me to Jesus Christ. Some of my fondest childhood memories have to do with Grandma telling me Bible stories when she and I fished from the pond dam. Grandma understood so well and taught me that the connection to God is deeper than simple words. I was baptized by immersion at the Baptist Church in Kiowa, Oklahoma, when I was 12 years old. Some folks don't think baptism is necessary, but Jesus thought so, and so do I. Though I don't go to church much now, I pray every day. God is 100% of my life. People can leave Jesus, but He'll never leave them. He has been with me all these years through trials and tribulations. There was a time or two when I might have been seriously injured or even killed had it not been for Him. And there have been times when I would have gone insane if I hadn't had Him to turn to. The best thing that ever happened to my daddy was my mama. They've known each other since they were young, and Mama can't recall when she first saw Daddy. He was just a little old fat kid who was always running around, she says. But she does remember in the 9th grade when he quit school forever. I think he got intimidated by high school because he had been sick in 1st grade and missed learning how to read. But what he lacks in reading he makes up for by a natural gift for figures. Somehow they got together, but they've forgotten their first date. They started going to church services or picture shows. Mama couldn't get enough of Clark Gable, Barbara Stanwyck, and many other movie stars of the 1940s. And I hated picture shows, Daddy says. I had to sit through them just to see her. Still, their courtship lasted for 5 or 6 years, depending on which parent you ask. After a while, Mama was looking for a marriage proposal, and finally she took matters into her own hands. I asked him, she said. They married on March 17th, 1950, when he was 22 and she was 23. Mama bought her own wedding ring for $27. Daddy put it on her finger, and for 44 years it has never been removed. They made their home just down the road from Grandpap and Grandma Alice. It was a 2-room shack with a wooden floor but no running water or electricity. Mama kept teaching school while Daddy pursued his rodeoing. Then Daddy won a car for winning a roping, and he told Mama to ask her brother Dale if he'd be willing to swap the car for his 80 acres down on Boggy Creek. Uncle Dale said yes, and it was a done deal. Mama stopped teaching after my oldest sister Alice was born in 1951. She was named Alice after Grandma Alice, who died in 1950. 2 years later, when my brother Pake was born, Daddy had to leave to go rodeoing. It was a hard time for Mama. Daddy left right after bringing Mama home from the hospital with a newborn baby. He got back home a few months later, and just as soon as he got into the house, he wanted to know where Pake was. He's on the couch, Mama said. You walked right past him. That's not Pake, that's Alice, Daddy said. Pake had grown so much that Daddy hadn't even recognized him. Clearly, Daddy had been away way too long. I was born on March the 28th, 1955. As it happened, that was the only year my folks were without health insurance. And so, as Daddy likes to tell it, he had to sell some hogs to pay for me. Not long after Mom and Daddy brought me home, Oklahoma City took their Boggy Creek property to be a floodplain for a new lake. So Mom and Daddy bought 100 acres south of Limestone Gap. By the time they brought my sister Susie home from the hospital in November of 1957, Daddy had a 3-bedroom house roughed in enough for us to live in. Susie's birth meant that Mama now had 4 kids under the age of 6. But by then, she was an expert at coping during Daddy's absences. She fixed water pumps, stoves, rigs, and washed clothes outside on a Ringer washing machine. Her abilities were a balance for Daddy's. He can do almost anything he makes his mind up to, except be a mechanic. He says if it can't be fixed with baling wire, it can't be fixed. He once tore his shirt and tried to mend it by pouring maple syrup over the tear and putting an encyclopedia on top of it. Mama stayed home till Alice was old enough to take care of us, and then she went back to work, selling fish bait down at the Atoka Lake. I remember how she went to and from work in an old pickup with no brakes or starter. Mama would park the pickup on a hill at night and scotch it with a rock under a tire. Then in the morning us kids would push it down the slope so she could pop the clutch and force start the engine. She parked it on a hill at work as well and had to pop the clutch to drive it home. Sometimes she went in before daylight and came home after dark. That's when fishermen won't bait. She earned $6 a day in the priceless respect of her children, who never heard her complain. Between Mama's pay and Daddy's rodeo earnings, they began to build up a cattle herd. Strangely, for all the ranching I did, I was never taught to ride. Daddy just took us kids when we were little and threw us up on a horse. We stayed up. It was your basic survival technique. By the time I was 6, I was gathering cattle, and doing it from before daylight until after dark by the time I was 7. It would be 4 a.m. and still pitch dark when Daddy would get us up for breakfast. Daddy would fry bacon, then fry eggs in the bacon grease. The eggs would literally float in the bacon fat. Talk about cholesterol. After Daddy gave us our instructions for the day, Grandpap would translate for us. Daddy was under a lot of pressure and stress from when he worked cattle, and that early in the morning tempers ran short. When Daddy was in a foul mood, he'd always interpret any questions as back talk, so we didn't dare ask him anything. If one of us did, he'd tell us to pay attention or pull your head out of your ass. I don't know what we would have done without Grandpap, who was sort of our rescuer. We'd chase cattle all day and brush so thick you couldn't ride through it. A lot of times we'd get lost. We'd give a holler that was an imitation of Grandpap's special yell, and when he would respond, we'd go back and forth that way until he found us. Alice was a better hand at working cattle than any man Daddy ever hired, and I've heard him say so. I've seen her ride a horse and to brush so thick that she couldn't see the steer she was chasing. She might come out a bloody mess, but she'd come out with a steer. Our land was just that rough until Daddy had it chained. Now what that means is, a chain big enough to anchor a battleship was strung between 2 bulldozers. The bulldozers were driven across the land, and the chain bent or uprooted everything. Then the bulldozers would push all the brush into piles, and later Daddy would set it on fire. When I was 6 and Susie was 4, I remember helping Daddy castrate some young bulls. I would stand behind the bull and hold his tail while Daddy sliced the sack and cut the cord that let the testicles fall. Daddy would pass the testicles to me, and I'd put them in a bucket. Next, I'd hand Daddy the penicillin to inject the bull with to prevent infections. Then I'd hand Daddy the knife so he could slit the steer's ears. This was called earmarking. It was a way to identify the cattle as ours, kind of like branding. Many times when we were done, I helped carry that bucket of testicles to the house, and Susie, Alice, and I would sit outside the back door and clean them. We called them mountain oysters. Then we'd take them into Mama, and she'd slice them real thin, roll them in flour, and fry them in hot grease in a huge cast-iron skillet. I was literally raised on mountain oysters. I've been kicked and run over by cattle, but I've kicked them back too. I got so mad one day when the cattle wouldn't go in the chute that I reared back and threw the hot shot, or cattle prod, at the wooden fence. It flew into 10 pieces and hit me right in the forehead. Mom and Daddy didn't say a word. Getting my head cut open was punishment enough for cussing. Daddy didn't accept any excuses. He kept a buggy whip above the door frame, and he'd get it down and snap it across one of us kids' behinds if he thought we needed it. He never warned us. He never told us we were getting on his nerves. He just let us have it. I've been asked if I resented the way Daddy whipped us kids. No, I don't. That's just the way he is. What I did resent were the times I had to work cattle with the men, then go in about 11:30 a.m. to cook dinner, which is what we call the noon meal. We cooked it, the men ate, we cleaned up the mess, then returned back to work with the men. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Me having to cook stopped when I was 11. It was noon one day, and Mama was at work, and Alice wasn't around. I don't know where she was. So Daddy told me, he said, "Reba, you go up to the house and fix dinner." I looked in the cabinets and found a can of green beans, lima beans, and pork and beans. I honestly didn't realize that everything I opened was a variety of beans. "Reba, are you partial to beans?" Daddy asked when he and the rest of the family came inside. Pake, who loves to tell this story, says, "Can you imagine a damn cattle outfit with no meat?" I don't remember Daddy ever sending me to the house to cook dinner again. When we were growing